Yo, so today I wanted to take a quick look at the draft analysis between KDF and T1. I thought it was a super cool series because this is the first time that we're seeing Rekkles in the LCK. So that's a very interesting thing to see. This is T1 Rekkles we're talking about. And I think I wanted to explore some of the options they use in order to take advantage of what Rekkles has to offer. He does have a great understanding of both AD and support. So I wanted to see how they leverage that a little bit in this series. And although they ultimately lost, I still think it's a really cool way to explore some of the areas of improvement for this team and their draft, because I think there's a lot to go over here, and as well as just some cool aspects of this team, including a fan favorite Poby. So starting with the game 1 draft, I thought this was the best use of drafting tools by T1 out of the entire series. The reason for this is because they managed to make great use of a Senaflex that allowed them to really have a hand and flexibility here. What I've been watching a lot of the games that have been going on, specifically from a draft perspective, and from what I've seen, the LCK kind of drafts a little bit differently than the rest of the world, because they put a very, very high emphasis and respect towards AD carry bans. It's not like the rest of the world doesn't, but specifically on red side, they are not okay with the B180 carry. Like, if either Varus or Ashe or Kalista are pretty much up, a lot of teams will not be happy with this as a B1. They don't have an answer to it, apparently. Other regions are willing to trade it. They kind of go for it with like Aphelios matchups. They go for Lucian Milio. But in Korea, I guess they're so mechanically tight with it, and it's so hard to kind of deal with the laning phase of these teams. It's probably not the greatest idea. So that's the first thing to note. The second thing to note is that Blue Slide very often ends up banning Nocturne or engage junglers, because it might be because of the way that R1, R2s play out, and the way that teams are picking their champions. But I think it's just something that they cannot deal with in a lot of compositions, and this could be a stylistic choice by KDF as well. What's also interesting, though, is that this is the first team, or the first game that I've seen where teams are okay with letting Rumble through, because they prioritize the 380 carries. So Rumble being basically best in slot for top lane is just going to be taken away by KDF. I imagine this was prepared because T1 automatically respond to Cassante and R1, R2, and then they go for the Senna. So this is where this is interesting. There's one element of flexing where you can pick a little bit later on, and then teams are a little bit confused as to where it's going, and you can threaten options in that case, and teams have to hedge for both. Another method of using it is actually just picking it super early, and then giving it food for thought for the enemy. So in this case, it's picked really early in R1, R2, and T1's okay with this by pushing the other roles back and giving them more resources in a sense, right? But what this also does is it provides flexibility in this meta, because if there's options for the Senna to work with both aggressive and defensive lanes depending on what KDF pick for their bottom lane. And that is the crux of this entire draft, I'm not going to lie. The reason for this is that when KDF inevitably lock their Poppy Azir, and then, very standard match into R3, then T1 have a chance to remove their options that can prevent some of the Senna lanes that they're ideally going for. If I were them, and I see Azir Poppy, these two are very notorious for being a 1-2 combo for essentially building the Great Wall of China. And the idea that this is an impenetrable front-to-back fortress, right? You got Poppy for the peel and setup, and Azir just for the damage and creating space. And that's the idea behind this. So if I'm T1, in my mind, I would like to lean towards the longer range Senna options, right? So I want to, and that's what we end up seeing here. So jungle on R4 is definitely the best. There's no reason not to, I would say, based on what junglers are viable in this meta. There's not that much flexibility in what's good, right? They're just going to blind a facilitator. And then I would say, yet again, in this meta, the most flexibility comes from bottom lane. So AD carry, but most importantly, support. And actually the weaving between the two, which is really funny, right? So When I see Azir, I'm T1. I'm thinking, let's siege. Let's try to get it longer. KDF went opt for Draven Renata, which is an attempt to kind of put a lot of pressure on this Senna in lane, quote unquote. But honestly, I'm not that big of a fan of this because they should have realized that Senna options can neutralize this. Renata is a great blind or a great counter pick and decent blind into engaged champions when teams are required to really build that around their composition. But in this case, we've already determined that that's not the way that T1 is going to win this game. So I don't think Renata would have been ideal here as an AD carry. So that's why the Caitlyn pick here is actually very smart, because now when you have a Caitlyn Senna lane, Caitlyn is a soft counter to Draven in terms of her range and just being able to kite her out. And then Senna is just going to melt this Renata because Renata has a really bad spread against pretty much every enchanter on the board or anything with long range because she has short range. She excels at front to back, but that's all she could do, right? So when you get Caitlyn Senna, a lane with just so much siege and disgusting amounts of artillery in the early game, this is just asking for bottom lane to lose plates, even when you have Draven. So sure, KDF has a great front to back, but in terms of lanes and in terms of the way their fights are going to play out as the game goes on, it's not going to look very good. So the way to resolve this would probably have either been to swap the support to something aggressive or facilitating, like perhaps Nautilus or Leona or something of that nature. There's so many AD carries banned, so understandably there's not too many left in this case, but there are some options in terms of something aggressive. Draven probably was fine here, but there's probably a fair amount of picks that they could have gone for. Aphelios would have also been fine, but they chose not to. So that's pretty much that. I still think Jinx is also pretty decent. Even Misfortune could have been decent into this comp, but maybe not as much, but probably something like that goes along with their theming, but mainly in the support role. So that's where that happens, and you see how this plays out. In lane is just very tough for the KDF bot lane to really force anything, right? This Caitlyn Senna has so much range, and then based on what happened here, you can probably tell that the KDF bottom lane just really forced this exchange. So we'll check in this replay. Right, it's not on paper, it's not that too bad of a trade, but they're gonna feel obligated because of how much poke this lane has, and that's basically the idea behind this first one. Touching on the second one, they end up banning Senna, so that's a good adaptation because dealing with Senna flex is not something you want to do when they're red again, especially when you're KDF and you chose blue again. So the ban they gave up in exchange for this was the Vi, so that's something to keep in mind here, but everything else is exactly the same. And it continues to be the same up until R3 actually, I believe. And Poby picks Nico instead of Orianna here. To me, the only indication that they want Nico here is potentially just having different pairings for their bot side that they want to play for, like just compositionally, because Orianna is just a standard control mage, but Nico is more focused on creating space for her team and playing against engage. So, or continue following up on setup. So it depends on what I trust they had a decent idea with it. And Nico's a strong champion on this patch, so I would say there's nothing wrong with it. Note that there's more AD carry bans, so just like we can count 7 with the 5 that T1 banned and Aphelios Senna that KDF banned. And there's really not many options left because lo and behold, they banned all of the AD carries. So what's left? They go for Xayah Rakan. In this case, although it's a good matchup in lane, I think the lane that KDF actually picked was in fact better. Sadly enough, they managed to dig deep into this pool and found Xayah Rakan, and then they respond with Azure Karma because there's so many AD carries banned. If I were T1, to be honest, when I see the same win condition where they're playing front to back, what you need to win is either guaranteed engage, which is pretty much banned except for Vi, and you already picked your jungler, or poke, which Azure Karma would have achieved perfectly. So if I were T1, I probably would have swapped these lanes, if I'm going to be honest with you. Most front to back exchanges here probably would not have been ideal, because if they pick one front to back champion, I think KDF would just match and then they're going to get stat checked. So it's not going to be the greatest in the world. So T1 needs to have something happen, right? Azir will have slight advantages if they picked Orianna here and they did standard. So with that being said, you answer that with Siege, and that's the only way to really go about this. And although they have decent lanes in bot side, I think what makes this a lot harder is that the matchup is contingent on T1 bot lane actually performing, or else they're just going to get outscaled. So that was probably the main problem with this one. And it's just, and like, even if they do well, right, compositionally, contextually, the scaling is favored for KDF. They have margin for error in this case, right? Unless, it's only if T1 blows this game out of the water, but I don't think that will happen because Lancer is just going to create so much pressure on top side. And that's prevents it from working in this game. Third game. This is the first time that T1 chose blue, and this is the first set of different bans because obviously KDF and T1 have switched sides. So KDF follow up with similar bans, except they don't ban Varus, and T1 actually just end up banning an AD carry early, and they go for Nocturne on B1. So while this is a strong champion on the patch, this might be a crutch for T1 as throughout this entire draft, as you'll be able to see in a bit. The thing with Nocturne is that it prevents Azir from being picked as well, at least in my eyes, because Nocturne is one of those unique champions that can go through Azir, so he's not actually impenetrable, so it's not that ideal to pick it. So they go for Orianna instead, who probably has better tools to address the scenario. Not the greatest, but still, it's not that bad. And T1 go for this, Nico, which is fine, and Cassante once more. So they really, I like it. I like what they're doing here. They're really pushing their bottom lane later and later into the game. I think this is where the Nocturne trap comes in, and perhaps T1 was saving their flexes for bottom lane as much as possible. Tech pick with the Udyr into, I believe it was Udyr into Cassante, by the way, which is pretty funny. So KDF are holding their cards as much as possible, and they have the Udyr tech pick into the Cassante, or they even hedge it into Cassante because no one would pick Udyr otherwise. Then KDF go with the safest AD carry pick possible with the 7 AD carries that are banned once again. They go for Aphelios. And in this case, T1 actually opt for Kai'Sa. So they go full forward. And I don't like this because there's still options that allow them to get countered in this case. I even think the Ezreal ban is redundant when you have a champion like Nocturne, because they're not going to pick Ezreal into a champ like Nocturne in my eyes. Ezreal is pretty hard to play against a comp like that potentially. So maybe the way to use it was Nocturne could just be an early game facilitator, and then you put threat on certain champions here, right? Aphelios is a great blind because he's not only good into forward comps, but he's literally the best champion at playing front to back and defending himself in terms of DPS. Because when you have Chakram, you have the highest output of like any AD carry in the game. And then when you combine that with Renata matchup counterable at R5, it's a little bit risky to go for this on 4-5, right? And support counterpick is something that's consistently underrated as well. We saw it in game 1 and we see it here as well. Just because of this one pick, it makes it so much harder for T1 to play their win condition, which is go in and delete priority targets. But when their priority target has the highest attack speed in the game, plus a Renata to make him live as long as possible, Kai'Sa is not looking too happy here, right? If it were me, I probably would have banned Aphelios Saya, and then what options are left here, right? There's not really much. You probably, what would it have been? Caitlyn? There's a Caitlyn, Ezreal, Zeri, or Jinx is possible, but Jinx would not be happy into Nocturne as well, right? So I think Aphelios would have been the only AD carry that really could have caused this T1 team problems, but they didn't address it, and it's just a slight mishap that ended up causing the matchup to not be that ideal, right? Same fundamentals here. Like I just said earlier in the video, Renata loves dealing with engaged champions, and this is what this is. And although T1 still gets a great advantage and they play to the best of their ability with it, they end up letting the game slip in the end. And I think KDF just grabbed just enough scaling in order to exceed T1 in this case. So really well, an interesting thought out draft plan and by T1. The only other thing I would point out is that they consistently weak-sided Dao, who's their top laner, and it's not like he isn't a weak-sided player, because I was looking at his games. He can play weak side, but he's also perfectly okay with resources. Like before, he played a ton of Jace and Renekton. We can ignore the win rate, but you see what I mean. He's capable of these play styles, and I guess in this case, the current strategy revolved around them playing for bottom lane. So that could be something to change for next time. Maybe they could reshift their priorities of different drafts. But that was the kind of breakdown of what happened in this game. So hopefully this makes sense to you guys. Really appreciate it if you made it this far. So see you around.